Hello, my name is Sonia Roitman and I work as a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland in Australia. Today I'm going to be talking about gated communities, and we are going to be discussing what are the key characteristics of gated communities and also why they are important to be considered as a planning element and in how we manage our cities. So gated communities have become a worldwide phenomenon. We can see gated communities in most cities around the world, not only in the global south, but also in the global north. Millions of people live in gated communities. When we try to have a quantitative understanding of gated communities, that's a bit complicated because there are not really single definitions of gated communities, and therefore it's very hard to be counting them. There is not really a record or registry on gated communities either. It's important to clarify how we can define them so we can have a similar understanding in this session today. So I'm going to go through some of the key aspects of gated communities. First of all, gated communities are residential settlements that are closed. They have barriers, walls, fences, or gates that delimit the perimeter of gated communities. They include individual housing, and sometimes they could also be high-rise buildings, and they can include a combination of both type of housing. There are security devices inside the neighborhood, the settlement, and they usually have high standard quality services. They have been designed to prevent penetration of non-residents, to provide security to residents. Yeah? And they privatize public space. So streets or green spaces that would be normally open and public, in this case, they are privatized. They can be used only by those who live inside these gated communities. There is usually a code of conduct, which is a set of regulations that are saying what sort of practices can be done inside by residents and visitors, and also some rules in terms of housing, what kind of housing is allowed inside. There is usually a residents association that is the body in charge of managing everyday life and keeping these regulations. And it's important to consider that gated communities are occupied by a particular group of residents who have decided to live there in a voluntary basis. Yeah? They have made a conscious decision about living in this particular residential type. So why they have made these decisions? And there are different reasons for this. The first one, it's a personal decision that has to do with security, yeah, and feeling that they are more protected, families and individuals. A second aspect has to do with avoiding interactions with other people, and in particular with people that we might think that they are dangerous. So avoiding contact with other social groups. It has to do also with the idea of having access to better services that are high quality, services and also infrastructure. And it has to do with the idea of accessing green spaces. In most cases, these gated communities have important green spaces and important sport facilities. So in that sense, the quality of life might be better than in the public city. It's also important that in some cities, this type of residential settlement might be the only option for some groups, and in particular for upper middle class groups. But we know that gated communities have also become a very much discussed topic because they have positive and negative consequences. So when we look at consequences at an individual level, there might be positive and negative consequences. However, when we look at the city level, most of these consequences of the sprawling of the development of gated communities are negative consequences. They create problems in our cities. So what are these problems? First of all, they discourage social interaction and social integration in cities. So they are exclusive spaces and they exclude people. So in this sense, they will go against what we are aiming for according to SDG 11, that is trying to have inclusive cities. At the same time, because they are usually occupied by upper middle class residents, they make income inequalities more visible in cities, and therefore they will be against SDG 10. So they will be increasing or showing more inequalities. They also privatize public space, as I mentioned earlier, and this means that only those who can afford living in gated communities have access to these spaces, and this is encouraging a much more individualistic view of the city, a much more individualistic view of what are our social values. Gated communities also fragment urban space. They are physical obstacles in our cities, and for mobility reasons, they create problems. People need to move around them in order to get to particular places. And finally, it's important to consider that in terms of safety, they consider safety as a commodity. So safety, that is something that can be enjoyed only by those who can afford living in this type of housing, which is normally a very expensive type of housing. So again, this will be going against SDG 11, trying to have inclusive cities that are accessible to everyone. So at the same time, it's important to understand the responsibilities that particular sectors might have in the development of gated communities. And it's very clear the link between gated communities and planning. So urban planners might be allowing for more gated communities to be built. So there are very different regulations in regards to gated communities across the world, and even within a country might be very diverse. In most cases, local governments are the ones that are responsible for allowing or not new gated communities to be built. In the US, for example, there are local governments that have been very explicit in terms of not allowing new gated communities. In the UK, at the same time, there are considered in planning applications as any other type of housing. In Argentina and in Indonesia, the same happens. They are considered as any other type of housing. There isn't really a national regulation in regards to gated community. So at the end of the day, it's up to the local governments to decide whether they want to have them in their territories or not. Very interestingly, 4 years ago in China, there was a new national regulation passed that was trying to address the problem of gated communities and was trying to minimize the number of gated communities being built, and at the same time emphasizing that some of the current gated communities should become open. However, it's not very clear to what extent this regulation is successful or not, and we will have to keep watching to see what's going to happen in China. Finally, what can we do about gated communities? So how can we minimize these negative consequences? The first aspect we need to consider is the scale of gated communities. If we have gated communities that are of a small scale or size, it's much easier to manage them, and they will be needing to go outside for services, for infrastructure, for job provision. So they need this constant relationship with the open city. So we need to encourage that. We need to encourage relationships between gated communities and the open city. So it's important as well to limit the urban sprawl and also have decisions in terms of whether we will allow more dense gated communities, for example, with more high-rise buildings inside, rather than single housing, mainly as a type of option available for these groups. It's also important to make sure that regulations are complied by developers. There are many gated communities that have failed to get the final planning permission. So it's important that we take responsibility on that and we follow all the regulations and frameworks that are allowed, and to what extent we can put in place some planning instruments that could be more inclusive, could be encouraging housing types that instead of creating divisions, they could encourage social integration, and in particular, social integration of different social groups. At the same time, it's important to find new ways to make sure that people who live in gated communities engage with other people who live in the open city. In Turkey, for example, there have been very successful examples of particular activities that have been run to make sure that these groups, which are different, are included. They can have mutual interest and they could run similar activities together. Finally, it's important to consider that if we have an open city with high quality services and infrastructure, then people will not be willing to privatize public space, and to create more democratic spaces. How can we make sure that we emphasize the positive aspects of the open city? And there are several examples in relation to public housing that have been successful examples on how to manage social integration in the city, how to manage the use of public space, well integrated to housing options. Thank you very much.